We'll break that down a little bit later in the show as we look at our big story, and it is the storylines from the Saturday that was. The conference's top-ranked team, Ohio State, survived in Evanston. They scored the final 21 points to beat Northwestern. Michigan outscored Rutgers 38-0 in the second half. And then the big news was in the West, as you guys were talking about. The first-place team, Illinois, lost at home to Michigan State. Purdue did not take advantage, though, lost to Iowa. We'll get to the West in a bit. Let's start in the East. What do you make of Ohio State, Howard? The weather was not great, and so I do understand that. But it was not an overwhelming performance by any stretch.
I think that when we look at this Ohio State team, we see this all the time, right? We look at them differently, talking about winning national titles. And for me, winning that national title is being able to be physical and controlling the line of scrimmage. It really, for me, getting to that game has less to do with what's going on the perimeter and more to do what's going on inside the tackle box. And they had some issues on both sides of the ball. Although they ran for 200 yards, they gave up 200 yards in rushing. So I know teams got to run the ball in those type of conditions, but it didn't look like they controlled the line of scrimmage to me.
Which means it didn't feel like they controlled the game. I think that's where, like, we're going to talk about Michigan. We're going to talk about the differences in these games. It didn't feel like Michigan was out of control in that game, where Ohio State was just struggling at the line of scrimmage on both sides. They were really struggling on third down, failed to convert the first 8 third downs in the game. It just seemed really, really hard. Yeah. And typically, if you're a better team in bad weather, you just line up, run the ball, do what you do, and they couldn't really do it in the way that we wanted to see Ohio State do.
And I think the part where it's troubling is Northwestern is the worst rushing defense in the Big Ten. And so to have to resort to using C.J. Stroud in the run game, which is essentially how they won the game. They converted a huge 4th and 1 with him, and then he had a long touchdown run to set up the touchdown that pretty much sealed the game. Were it not for him in the run game, who knows? And then on the other side, I mean, Northwestern had run for 18 yards against Iowa the week before. You knew they were going to run. I mean, the Wildcat formation, my goodness, like they haven't thrown out of the Wildcat formation ever. They basically were saying, we are going to run it straight at you. And Ohio State did stop it. I mean, Northwestern overused it ultimately. But for a while, they couldn't stop it, and Northwestern got over 200 yards rushing on it.
And to me, that's the troubling part of this game. You could talk about offensively. There were some drops on the offensive side, and you can talk about the weather, and you can talk about whatever you want to on that side, whatever excuses you want to use. But defensively, that shouldn't be happening. It's not any way that should be happening. You should be able to control the line of scrimmage with the players that they have, and what we saw from this team a week ago defensively, particularly the defensive line, you didn't see it.
Here's another thing. You're talking about, using C.J. Stroud as the last resort, and that's what Ryan Day said afterwards, right? Haven't we been saying for a while, though, we would like to see that be a little bit more of their offense and make defenses have to at least respect C.J. Stroud as a runner? And they're saying it was the last resort, and it looked that way, and they needed it.
It wasn't clear he really wanted to be a part of it, but he needed to be a part of it, right? So he ended up rushing for more yards than he threw for. Yeah, I mean, for whatever reason, part of it is you just don't want to get him hurt, which I do understand. And so we've talked about this a lot in light of
just
J.J.
having
McCarthy.
a threat. I think it's just a threat, and he hasn't really been doing that enough.
And it was clear Northwestern was basically saying, we're on every read option, we're going after the running backs, right? And so ultimately, kind of had to. I mean, they forced their hand, and had they not done it.
And Coach, they addressed that at the end of the game. They were adding extra players to the box, and they forced the ball into his hands. And you can do that from a defensive standpoint. You can dictate who you decide who you want to run the ball. And they forced the quarterback to run the ball. And he ran it and had some success with it. So I guess for me, it goes back to what I've watched this Northwestern team do up to this point. There's no way that it should have looked the way it looked Saturday.
Yeah. And again, the weather was dreadful. But the weather was dreadful for both teams. And frankly, Brendan Sullivan looked better throwing the ball than Stroud did.
Northwestern looked way more comfortable in that in an ugly game. And again, we hold Ohio State to such a high standard. But you got to do more even in that situation, even in those conditions.
And I will say this, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as you win the game. But I do think that what we're doing right now, and we'll get to this in a moment, is, hey, how do they match up with Michigan? How do they match up with the elite teams in the country? Like, they're undefeated. They've done everything they need to do. You always say it, Howard. I always feel like we have to reiterate it. This is a team, and I think Michigan's in that category now, too, that you look at through the lens of, are you a national championship team? And they didn't necessarily look like one. And Michigan didn't look like one in the first half either, but man, they did in the second half.
Right, and that's what we were expecting, right, from Ohio State. You expect that even if there's a slow start or something's off or the weather or whatever, you expect they turn it on at some point. Michigan really did that in the second half. I mean, 38-0. I think the more impressive part about that was the zero. I mean, the defense just was totally different. And Rutgers obviously had the fluky, you had some special teams stuff, and you had some deep balls by Gavin Wimsatt. But, I mean, the defense and just the way that Michigan is able to control games. That's where, like, even though Rutgers was in the game, it didn't feel like Michigan had lost control of it. And that's where, like, the committee talked about this last week because someone, you know, they said it's a workman-like team. That's the way they win these games. Is that a negative? No.
It's not, and it's not, and they go out and continue to play, you know, at a high level, even when they stub their toe a little bit, which they did obviously in the first half of that game because they went into halftime down. But you make the adjustments you need to make, and then all of a sudden things get rolling. And this was one of those games where JJ was usually in the high 70s as far as completion rates are concerned. This was his lowest output as far as completions are concerned. So there are things that, again, weather's part of it as well, but you have to go out and continue to make plays. And they find ways to really be able to win the game. But again, it's about controlling the line of scrimmage for me. I know you need to score points once you get into that game, once you get into those 14 playoffs, but you got to be able to control it. And I guess for me, it kind of switched to who I believe the best team in the Big Ten is right now by watching the way they play.
Same, and some of the conversations that we've had on the Monday Schmooze for the last few weeks is about Ohio State's run game, right? Like, can they do that? That's what we're talking about, the game against Michigan. You're going to need to be able to run the ball and be a factor at the line of scrimmage in those games. And then when we talk about with Michigan, it's the vertical passing game, it's JJ as a runner, it's all of these other things. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
Because they're on a collision course to meet at the end of the season. But right now, you've got to feel better about Michigan. I'm with you. I flipped the order of which I've been ranking these teams.
Right, and so I would have said, actually, going into last week, I felt Michigan was ahead. I hate to use that kind of transitive property, but it just, the Penn State game, I think, for me, was a big part of it, just the way that they manhandled Penn State and that Ohio State needed that huge fourth quarter to beat the Nittany Lions. So, but I think we kind of get back to addressing your deficiencies, right? And we've talked about Ohio State. Could they run the ball when they needed to? I don't think we got any more convincing an answer after the Northwestern game. Michigan, the deficiency we talked a lot about, it is the vertical passing game. That was part of it. I'm not sure we got a great answer there.
We didn't.
No,
but the red zone, we did, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they scored 6 touchdowns in 7 red zone trips.
Yeah, one of the things that truly is starting to really get me excited about this Michigan team, and because we talked about JJ being a part of the run game. Now, he doesn't have a conscience because that guy is not ducking out of bounds and not shading away from any big hits. But when he pulls the ball down to make a play, he's looking to get all the yardage that he can. And that, to me, really takes this team to another level when he starts to do that. If they start clicking with this deep passing game, this is a problem. I mean, they are absolutely a problem.
You know, you made this point, I think, on Final Drive on Saturday about the way that Michigan finishes the runs, too. They are just really physical, really tough. And so I think they had all of these capabilities, which is why the red zone thing was such a head scratcher, because they have such a great run game and such a great offensive line. But you really saw that play out. You knew that that was a focus. You knew that they had heard everything everyone was saying about the touchdown rate in the red zone, and they made a statement, I think.
And in fairness, Rutgers does not have a good red zone defense. They are a pretty good defense. They have not been great in the red zone this year. But still, to be able to run it down their throat, this is the 3rd straight game they've run for at least 275 yards. So we know they can be very physical at the point of attack. That was how they beat Ohio State this year. It's clear that's going to be their blueprint this season. How they beat them last year. It's clear that it's going to be their blueprint this year as well. And we'll see whether or not they can pull it off. These guys are on a collision course. Let's look at the schedules here going forward. Both have games this week against opponents that you would think they should be able to handle. Michigan has Nebraska and Illinois at home coming up. That Illinois game should be tough. And then they go to Columbus, get Ohio State, Indiana at home, and then what could be a challenging game against Maryland before the showdown. So I think it's clear all three of us believe Michigan is the better team right now. What are you watching in these next two games as they prepare for that showdown on Thanksgiving weekend that will kind of dictate how you view that game when we get to game?
Well, I think the weather is going to continue to be a factor, right? But I think JJ hitting those big plays, those explosive pass play games, right? I think two wide receivers. I think one of the things we've seen is Edwards be dominant in the pass game.
Yeah.
Really the way he was as a true freshman last year. When they get him involved in the pass game, he's very difficult to defend too. So I want to see him make those vertical and those explosive plays down the field. To me, that's where the separation can start to take place.
Ronnie Bell was also not available last year. Ronnie Bell had that injury right at the start of last season, and he is a stud.
Yeah.
And he is an important target in that passing game. So, yes, I mean, that's going to be a possibility. That's what we keep waiting to see them stretch. Also, do you think that it might be there, but we're not seeing as much? Maybe Jim Harbaugh doesn't want to play his hands on some of the things they're working on?
I think there's so many things that are out there, right? That you can afford to hold some things back, as you mentioned right there.
They're going to hold some back.
You're going to hold some things back that aren't going to show up to this Ohio State game. I mean, because they believe that they can win games in that manner. And then all of a sudden there's some new things, new wrinkles that show up. But the same thing's going to happen on the other side. Ohio State's going to have some different things as well, right? These are two really outstanding coaching staffs that are going to be heading toward one another to figure out who is the best team in the Big Ten Conference.
Well, in Ohio State, we've talked obviously a lot about the run game and all the different areas that we want to see them continue to improve. That Maryland offense is going to be a challenge for this defense, right? We came out of this game having some questions about, what they were doing at the line of scrimmage and what looked easy for a Northwestern team where it hasn't always looked easy offensively. So that's going to be a good test, I think, the week before Michigan as well.
I do think it's really interesting that they both have tough games the week before, because typically I don't think he would have looked at the schedule and said, well, those are going to be challenging games.
Yeah.
Maybe Maryland to some extent, and we knew Illinois was going to be good when we saw them, but would that be their toughest game of the regular season aside from Ohio State? I'm not sure we would have predicted that.
Right.
And so it is, I mean, on one hand, you always worry about, do you overlook an opponent? I think this makes it more difficult to overlook them, right? Because you're going to know, you're just going to have to turn on the tape and know, hey, this is a pretty good team that we're facing. But you may have to work a little bit harder than you planned on to win the game, Howard.
And I'd say one of the things that, if you're an Ohio State fan or you're a coach at Ohio State right now, they've been in a lot of tough games. So they know how they're going to respond in tough games. I mean, all the way to the fourth quarter. You've seen it happen. You've seen them have to take control of games, whether it's been special teams, whether it's defense really stepping up, different ways they've had to win. So I can create an argument that Ohio State's in a much better place than Michigan is to this point because of the type of games that they were in. But you've got to be able to take advantage. You're going to have, both teams, as you mentioned, are going to have tough games right before. So they'll be dialed in. You don't have a choice but to be dialed into these games if you want to ultimately get to where you're trying to go.
Also, we're in this part of the season. I love not talking about everything through a playoff prism, but we're in
Well,
that
you need to
portion
now.
of the season.
Right,
Yeah.
yes.
So I'm very curious to see, out of the carnage of everything that happened in the top 6 this week, what it means for Michigan and Ohio State. Would the committee consider flipping the order of the Big Ten teams based on some of the things that we've been talking about? They've got the film. They're looking at all of this as well. And I think, too, how it sets up for the possibility of possibly getting 2 teams in now that you're seeing some of the SEC teams get eliminated. The fact that Alabama is out of the playoff picture, what does that mean for where Tennessee is? What does that mean for some of these other teams that could possibly, open up a spot for a second Big Ten team? So I'm curious to see what sort of, I don't know if it's like a hint or, if we're going to read through the lines on Tuesday, but we're going to start to get clarity about those types of things.
I think what's interesting is I think Michigan's a better team. We all agree they're the better team. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they're ahead of Ohio State. I still think, though, that if they lose the game to Ohio State, I think they're going to have a really hard time getting in because of the non-conference schedule. I just don't see the committee rewarding them with that non-conference schedule.
Fair.
Whereas Ohio State, were they to lose, but if they play well here down the stretch, they could at least point to Notre Dame, and that Notre Dame win looks better and better. I mean, Notre Dame absolutely hammered Clemson this weekend. So that's the one where I worry about that from the Big Ten's point of view. If you're trying to get 2 in, it probably has to be Michigan winning that game still, even if they are ranked higher than Ohio State.
Yeah, you still probably need some help in the other leagues
Yes.
kind of beating each other up
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
bit as well. But it's going to be an interesting stretch run without Clemson and Alabama really as factors.
Yes. What a brave new world.
A little refreshing.
Somewhat refreshing.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I mean,
that.
you
It's
said it, I
refreshing.
didn't, but I was smiling when Nicole mentioned it.
Yeah.
Our big stat brought to you by Gatorade, focusing on the Big Ten West. Illinois falling to Michigan State Saturday. They still lead the division, but 4 teams are on their tail just a game back. Amazingly, everyone could still win the division, and yes, that apparently
What?
includes 1 and 8 Northwestern.
What?
I would like to see this scenario
Oh my
where
goodness.
the Cats end up in Indy for the 3rd time. That feels unlikely to me, but we do have chaos, and I think it points out to you how crazy things are. Let's start with Illinois. They have been so consistent, Howard. What happened?
Well, I think one of the things that happened, you saw some fumbles. Yeah, they lost one, but they had 3 in the game, so that kind of slowed some things down. And they played against a inspired Michigan State football team. You saw their leaders really step up and make the plays. Peyton Thorne was making the throws that we're accustomed to seeing him make, Reed making the catches, and then Henderson really leading that defense. So you saw their leaders, which they needed to step up in this game to make plays for them, and they got it done.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Xavier Henderson was clearly emotional
Yes.
about it. I mean, this was a very difficult week for Michigan State, and I thought that was really impressive, the defensive effort. And Scotty Hazelton and the way that they game planned for Illinois as well. But Illinois really struggled on 4th down. They really struggled in the red zone.
Yes.
Things that we just, if you have that many 4th down attempts,
That's the problem, right?
yeah, it's
One of 6.
something's going wrong in the game.
Something's not right.
1 of 4 in the red zone as well. So you put those together and you look at Michigan State and the success that they had in the red zone. They got down there and all but one time scored a touchdown, and that really was the difference in the game. It was execution down near the goal line.
Yeah, although that final drive, I actually kind of thought that Illinois might have
have a shot.
out. Yeah, that was the Michigan State defense we saw so much early in the season of just getting gashed and Tommy DeVito having his way. But yeah, that was it was really a remarkable performance by Michigan State.
It was, and I think that coaching staff and those players deserve so much credit, probably more credit than they're ultimately going to get, because that was, as you mentioned, was a very difficult week for them. And that in some way, I hope that it may have changed the perception, because I think they were getting kind of a bad rap as a program because of what happened 2 weeks ago. And that's not at all what Mel Tucker or the Michigan State program is all about.
So Illinois is still in good shape. Were they to beat Purdue and beat Northwestern, it would not matter what happens against Michigan. So win those 2 West games, and they are going to Indy. Iowa helped them out by beating Purdue and just pummeling Purdue.
Just throw your hands up.
Yes. So let's start. I want to start with the Purdue part of it. I mean, they are, you call it the choose your own adventure team.
They remain
They are
that way.
wildly inconsistent.
Yeah, and including defensively, which that's usually something that travels a little bit better. But Aiden O'Connell, it's tough to watch him have this season. I mean, we've had similar conversations about Sean Clifford, these 6th-year guys that have so much experience, have been through so much, and you just see them make mistakes, and you just wonder what's going through their head or how that could happen. And so, when Aiden O'Connell's good, this is a really good team and a really reliable offense. And when he's off, it's multiple turnovers, and it's issues like that. That was, I think, the biggest surprise.
Yeah, the fact that they're not consistent is what's so disturbing, because I was thinking, okay, they had a tough week a couple weeks before, right? But I'm like, whew, this is a team that's going to come out, and we're just thinking about, okay, what the offense is going to look like versus Iowa's defense is going to be a huge matchup, and it just flipped. Iowa's offense is what really, took the show, and we're sitting there like, where's this been? They've been holding back.
I mean, so O'Connell's, they've thrown 5 interceptions the last 2 weeks. They're 7 of 32 on 3rd down the last 2 weeks. But I'm flashing back to a moment on Saturday. We were doing the first set of halftime. So there were 8 teams playing, 4 games going on. And I made the comment that the only team that could throw the ball among those 8 teams at that point was Iowa. Right? I mean, no one else.
That was the biggest wind gust, right? That game was like 50-mile-an-hour winds.
I think Purdue and Northwestern were the 50-mile-per-hour gusts. Yeah.
Okay.
Where it was just
but yeah,
crazy.
obviously the Iowa passing game was the thing that traveled the best in the weather conditions.
Right, and everyone saw that coming.
Yeah, saw all of that coming. You know what was interesting about that game is Laporta at tight end. I mean, we really saw him. It seemed like being used the way we all thought he would be used at the beginning of the year for whatever reason. But, you know, they put him out, flex him out. They have a safety on him. Safety can't cover him. Put a linebacker on him, can't cover him. He's running outstanding routes. And they just got to find more ways of being creative to get him the ball because he is a difference maker.
You know, we're talking about some of the players who've been kind of like coming out of a tough stretch, talking about it, being a little bit emotional about it. Spencer Petras had some really great quotes after this game saying that cowards would give up on their season and there's no cowards on this team. But, like, he was really into it. I mean, he has borne the brunt of a lot of this criticism with this offense.
He has.
And now he's had 2 weeks in a row where he has just been really, really good. And they got a run game to complement it now.
And I got to tell you, I'm not mad at him for speaking up for
going into the media room and saying, you guys all buried us. Yeah.
I'm not mad at him. He's been trying to get that off his chest for a while now.
He has 2 performances now. It's not just one. He was waiting. He's like, nope, we can do it again.
Yep, I got you.
2 straight weeks over 375 yards of offense. So this is a team that was under 200 3 times.
They were dead last in the country.
Dead last in the country going into that Northwestern game and just like flip the switch and all of a sudden here they are. What about Wisconsin? The Badgers feel like they are rounding into form here as it was really kind of the prototype Wisconsin game. They ran the ball great. They played really good defense. Mertz struggled mightily. Again, the weather was atrocious, so you do understand it somewhat, but his numbers were really bad.
Yeah.
That being said, it feels like they have kind of found something here. Consecutive wins for the first time this year.
Exactly about the point about how they won it, right? With the ground game, with, 46 carries. Like that's, and the weather was a factor, but that is how Wisconsin is much more comfortable winning these games. And Graham Mertz was not efficient. He was not effective in this game, and it didn't matter, which I also think is a positive for where Wisconsin is. When we've talked about them early in the season about how like the game was going to be won or lost on his shoulders, it didn't need to be.
Right, and one of the things that was exciting to watch was their defense. Flying around, playing in the opponent's backfield. That's what we were accustomed to. And they had kind of lost that, whether it was because the players are injured or what have you, the transition they were going through. But to see them getting back to playing that aggressive style, at least being able to execute that style, was good to see. You all of a sudden, it's like, where's this team been? I mean, this is the Badger team that when you talk about them defensively, this is what they do. And they finally got back to that and were feeling like they were playing, getting back to accustomed to the football that they normally play week in and week out.
Get Iowa this week, and whoever wins the game is bowl eligible. They both have long bowl streaks going. You stay in that conversation in the Big Ten West. Wisconsin has had its way against the Hawkeyes recently. They've won 5 of the last 6, but those are 2 teams that it felt like were down for the count.
Yeah.
In Wisconsin and Iowa.
And now all of a sudden,
they're up off the mat.
Yeah.
One of them made a head coaching change.
Yes.
That stunned us all. And you're seeing the response. You're seeing the development and the growth in some of those areas that we were looking for in the beginning of the season.
10 hoop season tips off tonight. This very evening, 13 Big Ten teams in action. Everyone other than Purdue, they get going tomorrow. Ranked teams in action. Number 13, Indiana is Morehead State. 22nd ranked Michigan hosts the Mastodons, that one on the Big Ten Network. And number 23, Illinois will battle Eastern Illinois. And Andy Katz is here to sort it all out for us. Unofficially, he's been on Big Ten Today more than any other guest host, co-host.
I would say,
I don't
first
have
of
the
all,
official numbers.
What did Purdue do wrong that they can't play tonight?
Maybe they wanted the whole night to themselves.
Yes.
They get the Big Ten Network spotlight tomorrow night. So, so 13 teams tonight. We'll dive into the schedule and tell you about the 2 games here on the network. But just kind of big picture on the league. Last 2 years, 9 teams have made the NCAA tournament. No one's made the Final Four. Those 9 teams are the most ever in the tournament. It's happened in successive years. Obviously, the postseason success hasn't necessarily been where the league wanted it to be. Jim Boeheim was kind enough to remind us of that at ACC Media Days. Give me a sense of where you think the league is this year.
Okay, first of all, as we have said many times on this set, you only have to be as good as your competition this season, the current season. So bold prediction on day one, 9 are getting in again. Doesn't mean 9 great teams, doesn't mean they're going to have a title contender, but the rest of the country, if you look at the landscape, the Big Ten has at least, I think, 9 quality teams relative to the rest of the country that can get bids.
Okay, so you feel like there is good depth in
Yes.
the Big Ten for sure. Let's talk about the top and who you see as the elite teams, because I do think that's where it's interesting. And look, we just have to be honest on what you're seeing. I mean, nationally, the Big Ten doesn't have a team in the top 10. And it's been a long time since that's happened. Since the 1970s, there wasn't a team in the preseason top 10. Who do you think the top of the league is?
So I actually think that was a mistake. I'm not an AP voter, but I think Indiana should have been a preseason top 10 team based on who the Hoosiers return, including Trace Jackson Davis, who we'll mention here momentarily. They got the core of their team back from a team that beat Wyoming in the first 4, lost to St. Mary's in the NCAA tournament. And in a year where there's been so much movement in this sport, and you had a team that returned essentially its core group, there's no reason why that team should not have been in the top 10. After that, it really is wide open. Illinois was picked second. I think that's legitimate, but it is pretty much a new team for the most part. Michigan, obviously, with Hunter Dickinson back, they deserve their mention. I actually think Michigan State has a legitimate shot to compete for the title in the Big Ten and finish second based on the fact that they have almost their entire core back this season.
Interesting in watching Indiana, and the exhibition game was, I mean, that was not great competition by any stretch, even as exhibition games go. But man, it's hard not to get excited about Malik Renew and Jalen Hood-Schifino. Those guys were both really, really good in that game. So you talk about a team that brings back its core and then has a really exciting freshman class. I think I was starting to buy in along the same lines that you are. I just don't think there are many teams that can match up with Trace Jackson Davis and Race Thompson up front. That's a really potent combination. They've got a lot of experience, and then to have 2 really exciting young players.
And I think people forget, first of all, Xavier Johnson played phenomenal down the stretch, really anchored their defense, which was the reason that they went on that run during the Big Ten tournament and to get into the NCAA tournament. And so if that carries over, which we would assume it would because those core guys are back, if Miller Kopp can start making some shots, that is something that can elevate them because that's within him. He just didn't do it as well last season. And if he can do that and get back to the way he was as a shooter, then I think Indiana takes that next step.
I worry a little bit about Illinois shooting. Their 3-point shooting against Quincy in their exhibition game, I think they were like 6 of 34. 6 of 34 on threes in that game. It doesn't seem like maybe they have a great knockdown shooter. Maybe it's Matthew Meyer from Baylor.
To me, he always was more of a slasher at Baylor, but they've got experience. And I think with Meyer and Terrence Shannon Jr., coming back or coming into the Big Ten, Big 12 kind of tough players, I think that will help them. But you're right, that's going to be their issue. But they are going to have, I think, more possessions because they're going to be going up and down without Kofi Cockburn.
And it's a different look with Coleman Hawkins, right? I mean, he shot a few 3-pointers in that game. He can really run the floor. RJ Melendez can run. I mean, they've got really good athleticism.
Well, by the way, they were out without Luke Goody.
Who's injured.
Yeah,
yes.
So if he comes back, he should be one of their better shooters.
You had Michigan and Purdue in your top 5 as well. We'll get into Michigan in a moment, but Purdue obviously has the huge matchup issue for everyone with Zach Edey. Caleb First, I believe he's going to have a really good year for them. To me, the issues are the backcourt and whether or not they have a true point guard.
And that was an issue last year because, was Jaden Ivey a true point? And there were times, believe it or not, when pressure bothered them. We saw that happen in the Big Ten. So I think that issue has still not been solved. And I think it's fair to wait on Zach Edey's condition. When we were with him in the Big Ten Media Day in Minneapolis, he said he can play 30 minutes.
Yeah.
But let's see it because he's never had to do it in his Purdue career because of Travion Williams. So can he be on the floor for that amount of time without getting winded and be as effective? So let's wait and see.
Yeah. Also wonder a little bit with them, are there enough go-to scorers, right? Kind of once you get beyond him. I mean, like
There's
Mason
Newman,
Gillis.
do they become that?
Yeah. But again, really interesting team and so well coached. I mean, I do think that is the variable in this league that I know every conference in the country thinks they have really good coaching, but we have seen the coaches in this league elevate teams and players. We see players get markedly better as their careers go along, and we've seen players make big jumps, and we saw it last year, guys who ended up in the lottery who were probably nationally a little bit of afterthoughts coming into the year. What about the top players this year? Who do you have at the top of your list?
And the one little bow on the Purdue is that they have a great home court, so they're going to get wins at Mackey.
Right.
Top players, Trace Jackson-Davis, obviously. He's, I think, a first-team All-American. Hunter Dickinson could be a first-team All-American as well, or at least a second. After that, Zach Edey, again, big. Certainly could be an All-American, if not a Big Ten Player of the Year. And then it gets really interesting. Chris Murray, for me, I checked him at number 4. Keegan Murray, his twin brother, now at the Sacramento Kings. And Fran McCaffrey is going to basically funnel a lot of the offense through Chris, and he can handle it. He took some big shots last season. And then, even though he's not playing tonight because he's still out with a foot injury, Jamison Battle, assuming he comes back healthy from this foot injury, I've got him as an all Big Ten player. Averaged 20 points a game on the Gophers last season, a team that started strong and kind of faded. If he can match that, I'm not saying Minnesota's going to be a tournament team, but he will put, I think, Big Ten type numbers up there to be a first teamer. Especially now he's going to have an elite player next to him in Dawson Garcia, who's questionable for tonight, but he may get, he's had a muscle strain. But if once he plays to his potential from 2 years ago at Marquette, you put Garcia next to Jamison Battle, that's a really good 1-2 punch.
Transfer from North Carolina,
Yes.
coming home to the Twin Cities.
Marquette, Carolina, and then
yes,
Minnesota.
Yeah, had some personal tragedy last year in his family, and again, good to make that addition to the roster. They're still, that's not a really deep team, and it's going to mean Battle's going to be on the floor a
Right.
lot.
But
Yeah.
that's why I think he's going to put up
No,
numbers
absolutely.
to deserve
Yep.
recognition.
No question. Okay, so let's get into tonight's games. Give people a sense of Michigan. I mean, this is another one where everyone knows Hunter Dickinson. He is a superstar. He's going to be one of the best players, not just in the Big Ten, but in the country. And then beyond that, I mean, Jet Howard was incredible in their exhibition game.
He had 30.
30 points in like 25 minutes. I mean,
and that's the big question for Michigan. We wanted to know what would happen with, the scoring outside of Hunter Dickinson.
Right.
I know it's an exhibition, but if that can be duplicated, even just, in the mid-teens or high teens,
right.
That's significant for Michigan. They've got essentially a new roster, or at least I should say a newer roster in terms of contributors that are in sort of higher profile roles. And so they're going to be a work in progress. They're going to have a very difficult schedule. A lot of highlighted games, including playing Kentucky and London at the O2 Arena. They've got North Carolina in later December. So that's the other thing I think Big Ten fans are going to have to just pause a little here at the beginning of the season, because there might be some losses, but they're going to be against really good teams. And I don't think that should raise the red flag. Now, if you get some of those wins, that's going to be significant, especially a team like Michigan State.
Won't necessarily be an easy game tonight either. I mean, as far as openers go, IPFW won 10 straight games at the end of last year. They were one of the better teams in their league. So,
well, the Mastodons
yes.
actually, I think, could be the pick out of the horizon.
Right.
And Big Ten fans will remember Indiana.
Yes, Indiana. Well, of course,
they went to Fort
They made the
Wayne.
mistake of going
Yes,
and
yes.
playing there. Yes. Wisconsin gets South Dakota tonight, kind of a middle-of-the-road summit team
Yes.
in terms of
Not
where
the
they are
Jackrabbits,
picked.
the Coyotes.
Yes, these are the Coyotes.
Yes.
Yes. South Dakota State, the Jackrabbits, Vermilion. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you got tonight for Wisconsin? The only team in the league, by the way, with 2 preseason all-conference players, according to
What
the
I also think is significant, Dave, is the Badgers haven't started a season with their full complement of players fully healthy in a while, and they are. And just checking in with the Badgers this afternoon, they're ready to go, which means we're going to see like the Wisconsin team that Greg Gard was hoping and obviously had in France. A little tease for the 3-part series.
The big
there.
trip.
The big trip.
Yes.
Very good. So what you saw in that, you will see tonight. And that means a lot more from Tyler Wall and Chucky Hepburn. They are going to be their 1-2 punch. I'll be really interested to see, where Jordan Davis fits into all this. They've also got a couple of transfers that I think are going to be significant. But it's not fair, because we just had two twins, last season at Iowa and Wisconsin. Yeah. They're different people. And yes, Chris Murray can make up for Keegan's production. It's not fair to put that same thing on Jordan for Johnny, because Jordan's going to be much more of a spot player.
Chris Murray played a much bigger role at Iowa last year than Jordan Davis played at Wisconsin last year. All right, so you're here for the tip-off show tonight?
Here tonight.
All right.
Ray Fell back with me?
Yeah.
You won't be, but we'll get these.
I'll rotate in as football winds down. I got a lot on my plate.
San Diego on Friday.
San Diego, you'll be on the
USS
battleship.
Abraham Lincoln, Michigan State Gonzaga.
All right, let's try to avoid the condensation on the floor.
Yeah.
Do everything
It's an afternoon game.
Can you control that?
I will try.
I'd find it hard to
I thought
believe.
It didn't rain in San Diego. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, you can see those games tonight. Again, Hunter Dickinson and Michigan taking on Purdue Fort Wayne, and then it is Wisconsin and South Dakota. The tip-off show comes your way, by the way, at 6 p.m. Eastern tonight, the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app.